SCP-016 is called Sentient Micro-Organism, sort of like the one that's been living in my body. Which is not sentient, but I got COVID over the last week, and I'm just starting to feel like myself again. So we're gonna start doing some more reaction videos as long as my voice holds up and stuff, guys. This one's by Dr. Bob. Make sure to subscribe. Subscribe to me if you like reaction videos too, and let's get into this one.
A doctor frantically writes in his journal.
Okay.
It's almost impossible to believe everything that's transpired has taken place in such a short amount of time. It all began 3 days ago.
All right.
It was just another day down in the mines. A worker was drilling into a seam of coal when suddenly there was an issue with the rig.
Okay.
From what I've gathered, it sounds like the drill bit exploded due to some kind of mechanical defect, sending shards of metal flying throughout the tunnel.
That sucks, dude.
The worker was lucky that none of the large pieces struck him, as they surely would have been fatal.
Very much so.
He had, though, still been grazed by a piece of shrapnel from the ruined drill bit, and it had left a deep cut across his upper arm.
Is it a microorganism?
Other miners who were working nearby heard the commotion and quickly came to his aid. They applied a tourniquet to stem the flow of blood and helped him to the mine shaft elevator for the long ride to the surface.
Right.
Once they reached the safety of daylight, they brought the injured man to the on-site medical clinic, where I was on duty at the time.
There's that music.
I cleaned the wound since there was a substantial amount of coal dust that had gotten inside, before suturing and bandaging it.
Right.
The miner was sent to his bunkhouse to recover, and I thought that would be the end of it.
Thought it would be the end of it.
It was only the beginning. Roughly 24 hours later, the same miner presented himself to me once again. I asked about his injury, and he explained that while his arm was fine, he now felt like he might be coming down with an illness. His symptoms included a runny nose, a cough, and body aches. So my assumption was that he'd simply had some bad luck and caught a cold that just so happened to coincide with being injured on the job. I sent him to his bunk once again, telling him that he wouldn't be able to work and should instead use the day to rest and recover.
And not
the next day I was once again in the clinic when my phone rang. It wasn't the sick miner, but instead his supervisor.
Wow.
The miner hadn't shown up for his shift that morning, and he asked for me to go check on him since he knew he hadn't been feeling well.
Right.
I agreed that it was strange that neither of us had heard anything else from the miner and went to see him straight away.
Is he dead already?
I entered the bunkhouse where many of the workers stay while on site at this remote mine. It was empty, except for the injured miner who was still in his bed.
God. He's
As
green
I approached, I could immediately tell something was very wrong. The man was curled up in the fetal position and was sweating profusely while also shivering.
Very bad fever.
A quick touch of his forehead revealed that the man had a high fever, too. He was practically incoherent, seemingly delirious from his high temperature. The miner was moved to the empty bed inside the clinic so I could better observe and tend to him.
So reminiscent,
very carefully, since I assumed now that he was actually suffering from influenza and didn't want to risk an outbreak at the mine.
Right.
I was getting ready to administer fluids to the miner, who was still mumbling incomprehensibly, when I noticed something on his face. It appeared that he was crying, but the tears that ran down his cheeks weren't made of water. They were blood.
Oh my God.
I hadn't seen anything like it before. There was no reason why influenza should be causing this man to cry tears of blood. I could see the veins in his forehead starting to pulse, as if his blood pressure had suddenly skyrocketed.
Golly.
And just as I was leaning in to get a closer look, something horrible happened. The miner suddenly opened his mouth and expelled an enormous stream of blood. The blast of blood struck me in the face and knocked me backwards in fright. The man continued expelling more and more blood from his mouth, which soon covered the walls of the clinic. With seemingly all the blood having been discharged from his body, the man then went limp.
Jesus!
I attempted to resuscitate him, but strangely, there was no need. The man was comatose, but he was alive. There I was, standing in the middle of the clinic, both he, myself, as well as the room completely covered in blood. It was one of the worst things I'd ever experienced as a doctor, and yet somehow it was about to get even worse.
What?
I was still in shock from what had just happened when I heard the door to the clinic open behind me. I turned around to see a group of half a dozen more miners from the site. Each one coughing, sweating, and shivering.
Oh no.
One held a cloth to his ear that was stained red, while another attempted to stop his nose from bleeding. Whatever had infected the first patient wasn't a one-off medical event.
No.
This had the makings of an epidemic. I knew that I was in way over my head.
Yeah.
I was just a general practitioner, not an infectious disease specialist.
Oh my gosh.
And they called the Center for Disease Control to get their guidance. I was told to quarantine the sick man as best I could, and that a rapid response team would be sent who were better
What
equipped
about
to
you?
deal with potential
You would probably
outbreaks.
get it too, right?
While I waited for the
You got
CDC to
bled?
arrive, I began moving the afflicted men to a bunkhouse that had been designated for quarantining. Several more also began expelling huge amounts of blood, though unlike the first patient, none of the others survived the traumatic event. As I was putting the final infected man into a bed, I noticed something, though. There was a huge amount of heat radiating off of his lower body.
Okay.
When I pulled down the blankets, I discovered something that even with all of the strange happenings, I still couldn't believe. There were huge lumps growing on his legs, each of which looked to be filled with some kind of fluid or gas.
Gosh.
And they were extremely hot to the touch, as
This
if
is
the chemicals
so
inside
gross.
the lumps were creating a source of heat. As I was investigating the bizarre growths, I suddenly looked up to see that the man was no longer in a state of delirium. Instead, a crazed look had come over his eyes, and he
Jesus.
suddenly leapt out of bed, flailing and clawing at me as if he wanted to kill me.
Like
I
a
don't know how.
zombie.
I was able to fight off the man and run out of the bunkhouse. He gave chase, though, and with no
Look.
other option, I ran into a nearby storage
hot.
shed. The man was beating and scratching at the door, but I was able to barricade it by dragging a heavy shelf in front of it.
Jesus.
After several minutes
This is
of trying
something out
to
of
break inside,
nightmares.
he finally gave up and left. And here I remain. I'm too afraid to go back out. It seems that if the disease won't kill me, then whatever it is turning people into will.
Gosh.
All I can do is wait for the CDC team to get here and hopefully know how to deal with whatever the
Y'all just
situation has
thought
become.
COVID was bad.
The doctor closes his small notebook and notices a drop of something fall onto the cover.
You
He
bleed.
reaches up and wipes his hand across his
I
mouth.
knew it. I mean,
comes
you got
back,
bled on, bro. You've
covered in
been around
blood.
all them people.
The doctor didn't know what the disease was that had so rapidly spread through the workers at the mine, nor did the CDC response team when they arrived.
It's like Ebola.
No,
or
it wasn't until the SCP Foundation caught word of the mysterious outbreak that someone would finally determine what was happening with what would soon be called SCP-016,
016.
which is also known as the Sentient Micro-Organism. SCP-016 is a blood-borne pathogen that was first discovered after a worker at a remote mine was injured while drilling into a coal seam deep beneath the earth.
Right.
It is theorized that coal dust entered the wound, dust which perhaps carried dormant spores of what would become SCP-016. Over the next several days, all of the remaining employees at the mine were infected, as was the CDC crisis team that was sent to the mine to investigate the outbreak of what was potentially an undiscovered pathogen. Following the CDC's inability to deal with the disease, the SCP Foundation took over the site and quickly terminated all affected personnel in order to prevent further spread.
Wow.
The first infected person, Patient 0, was taken into Foundation custody for further investigation, and the mine shaft itself was collapsed by an explosive device in order to seal it off.
Right.
After studying Patient 0, the Foundation learned a great deal about just what they were dealing with. What they found was that SCP-016 has an incubation period that can vary wildly from just 24 hours to as long as 2 years, with the length appearing to be dependent on the number of other potential human hosts in the immediate area.
Really?
Once symptoms begin to present in an individual, they will at first look to be quite similar to the common cold. They can include coughing, a runny nose, itchy eyes, and body aches. Roughly 48 hours after the first symptoms, the infected person will experience a form of hemorrhagic fever, similar to the Ebola virus, which
that's what
causes
I
a
thought,
small
the
amount
Ebola.
of bleeding in the lungs. This leads to the infected blood becoming aspirated, most likely in order to better spread through the air. The third stage of the disease leads to the host crashing and bleeding out, as they start to bleed profusely from multiple body orifices, including the nose, tear ducts, mouth, and even through the pores of their skin. Their blood pressure will also skyrocket during this final stage, and in some cases, have vomited blood as far as 5 meters.
God dang.
Oddly enough, although most die from the traumatic
5
event,
meters?
this almost complete exsanguination will not always result in death. Sometimes, following the removal of almost all blood from the body, the patient will somehow survive, and the pathogen inside their body will return to its dormant phase once again, before eventually repeating the process.
Wow.
But SCP-016 is more than just a rapid and often deadly blood-borne disease, as you will soon see. As SCP researchers studied the disease, what they discovered was that it had a very strange property that sets it apart from other hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola and the Marburg virus.
Never
What they
heard of
found
Marburg.
was that when someone infected with SCP-016 is placed into a high-stress situation, such as one where their life is being threatened, SCP-016 will transition from rapidly reproducing inside of its host's body to instead begin rewriting their host's actual DNA.
Really?
This genetic manipulation, combined with the stimulation of rapid cell division, leads to the host undergoing major physiological changes and in extremely small amounts of time.
Wow.
In just 24 hours, the host can begin showing physical changes to their body, and a complete bodily reconstruction can occur in less than 2 weeks.
Jesus.
Most of the hosts who begin to undergo physical changes will not survive the process,
Right.
due to how heavily the transformation stresses the body, but those that do will be changed in more than just physical ways. They'll exhibit hyper-aggressive behaviors, not dissimilar to those infected by rabies.
Ah!
And it's theorized that the pathogen may cause this behavior in order to better spread the virus. When the Foundation realized that
is
SCP-016 was capable of these transformative effects, they immediately undertook a number of experiments on D-Class personnel in order to better understand their full
Poor
extent.
D-Class.
In the first test, a D-Class was infected with SCP-016.
Can you
And as
imagine?
soon as they began showing symptoms, their cell was slowly flooded with water in order to stimulate the life-threatening situation needed to trigger the transformation process.
Right.
Over the next 24 hours, researchers watched as the subject appeared to develop gills,
Gills?
which would allow it to survive in the now water-filled cell.
Wow.
The transformations didn't stop there, though, and over the next 2 weeks, the subject also had their limbs change into fins, their eyesight deteriorated, and their sense of hearing increased as they developed an echolocation
fish.
ability very similar to the one employed by whales and dolphins.
What
The experiment
heck,
was
dude?
concluded by removing all of the water from the cell, leading to the death of the subject from asphyxiation, as they could no longer breathe in the open air.
Right.
A similar experiment was performed on another D-Class, but this time, instead of taking on aquatic animal properties, the D-Class experienced rapid muscle growth, and their knuckles grew bone-like protrusions. It attempted to use both of these to break through the door of their
break
flooding
through.
cell, but they were unable to breach the reinforced steel, and
Right.
soon died from drowning. The Foundation now
So
knew
it just
that the virus
thinks.
could react in different ways to the
Yeah.
same situation. The same experiment was run a third time, but in this instance, the infected D-Class exhibited an entirely different means of trying to escape. The subject had a massive growth appear on its chest, which seemed to be fed from 2 different tubes of flesh, also emanating from the subject's body. Fearing what it planned to do, the Foundation ended the experiment early and terminated the subject.
Gosh.
An autopsy revealed that the growth was actually a hollow chamber that was being fed by the tubes with oxygen and acetylene gas, which when combined in sufficient amounts would cause a massive combustion event.
It was gonna blow up.
SCP-016 was turning the subject into a living bomb.
Wow.
Moving on
Gosh.
from flooded cell tests, the researchers next left the D-Class inside of a room with no stressing elements, and instead told them to focus on growing a pair of wings. Without any reason to begin the transformation process, SCP-016 went through its normal stages, and the subject
Can
died
you
from blood
imagine?
loss without any other changes occurring. In the final test, a D-Class was placed inside of an acrylic box that was
acrylic
suspended
box
over a mine
suspended
shaft,
over a
with a
mine
timer
shaft.
attached indicating the time when the bottom of the box would open and drop the D-Class into the 1,000-foot deep shaft.
Wow.
This D-Class was also told to focus on growing wings that would allow them to survive the plunge. The
Right.
subject began to transform over the next 24 hours, but rather than grow wings, they instead developed a tentacle-like appendage on their arm that was capable of producing silk, similar to a spider's spinneret.
Spider web.
They used the silk-producing organ to secure themselves to the box, showing that subjects did not appear to be able to control the way in which SCP-016 would alter
Right.
their bodies. This experiment concluded when the timer reached 0, and the bomb attached to it detonated, as had been the plan all along.
Right.
Following this last test, SCP-016 samples were placed into containment, and access to the sample for experimental purposes is only allowed with prior authorization from Level 4 or O5 personnel, with
Okay.
full documentation of the proposed experiment required beforehand. Failure to follow any of these procedures will lead to the offending personnel being reassigned to D-Class duty or terminated.
Dang.
SCP-016 has been classified as Keter, and the
Yeah.
only existing sample is kept in a petri dish, which is under extreme lockdown inside of a 5x5 by 5 meter room,
Yeah, you
where
don't
the
want that
temperature
to
is
get
kept
loose,
below
buddy.
0 degrees Celsius at all times. Should an outbreak of SCP-016 occur, all infected personnel are to be immediately terminated on site. And if
Yep.
the infection cannot be contained within 48
Nope.
hours, then the on-site nuclear device is to be detonated prior to any additional personnel being evacuated. While the
Sheesh.
containment procedures may sound callous, unfortunately, when it comes to anomalous pathogens as dangerous as SCP-016,
No chances could be
no
taken.
chances
I
can
agree.
be taken. Now go and watch another entry from the files of Dr. Bob.
Guys, this was this might have been the wrong SCP for me to watch after COVID. I gotta tell you, man, for a little while, I never felt anything like this virus before. Like, I've been, you know, I'm over 40 years old. I've been experiencing different kind of sicknesses for a long time, and I've never gotten anything like this before. And I gotta tell you, like, with the body aches and stuff like that, and feeling like your lungs are infected with something, it's really scary. It scared the heck out of me for a few days there. I mean, I never got to the point to where I felt like I wasn't recoverable or whatever, but it's ugly, man. It is ugly, and something like this was kind of mind freaky right now, man. Guys, Dr. Bob, make sure to subscribe to him. Subscribe to me if you like reaction videos too. Thanks so much for watching. As always, this is Zueljin signing off. We'll see you next time.